introduce our author today, Jennifer Egan. Jennifer was born in Chicago and raised in San Francisco. She's the author of 5 books: The Invisible Circus, which was a novel which was made into a movie with Cameron Diaz; Look at Me, which was a finalist for the National Book Award in Fiction. If you don't know what the National Book Award means, that's sort of like being nominated for a Grammy. You know, if in the writer's world, that's really good. As well, she wrote Emerald City and Other Stories. She wrote The Keep, which was a national bestseller, and as well, her new book, A Visit from the Goon Squad. She is a recipient of many, many awards, honestly, too many to mention here. Excuse me, she's also a journalist, an award-winning journalist, often publishing in the New York Times Magazine. And she has won awards for, one, her cover story on homeless children, and another one about a bipolar kid, The Bipolar Kid, which won an Outstanding Media Award for Science and Health Reporting. Excuse me. And her new book, which is A Visit from the Goon Squad, and which is just out in paperback, has been called a literary sensation. What I love about this book is, in interviewing Jennifer earlier today, I realized she wrote this whole book as a way of procrastinating so she wouldn't have to write something else, which I just love. Since then, it's been on nearly every single top 10 list for the best books of the year for 2010. And it's a wonderful book. It's in 13 different voices. It goes from the 1970s into the future. It's written in the first person, the second person, and the third person. It is experimental. It is fun. It has a PowerPoint presentation in the middle of it. And most of all, it explores music and the self and how these two intertwine. So it is with great, great happiness and honor that I introduce to you Jennifer Egan.
Thank you so much. It's great to be here. Can you guys hear me? All right. So I thought I would talk, since I know that a lot of you are writing students and just generally students, I thought I would talk a little bit about just kind of how this book came to be, since it is sort of odd. It's not a traditional, straightforward novel where you kind of figure out who it's about and follow them through time chronologically. And in the course of explaining that, read to you a little bit from it here and there, and then answer any questions you might have. As Suzanne said, I was trying to avoid writing a different book, which I still have not started, I'm sorry to say, when I decided to do something else for fun, and which is what ultimately became this book. And the incident that led me to even think that it might be fun to dabble in some of this material was that I was in a hotel in the bathroom washing my hands, and I looked down and I saw a woman's handbag with a wallet sitting right on top of it, in absolutely visible. This is in New York City, okay? And I looked down and I immediately felt very anxious because I have been robbed innumerable ways, happily not including physical violence. But in every other way, you know, motorcyclist, person on foot, you know, basic pickpocketing, apartment break-in, and then the worst, well, not worst, but somehow the one that stays with me the most was a time when my wallet was stolen, and shortly thereafter I got a phone call from a woman from Citibank who was very helpful and very sweet and understanding and also seemed very professional. And she offered to help me change my PIN number since she understood that she had received a call that my wallet had been stolen. So I was thrilled and relieved because I was worried about my cash card being gone. And in the course of changing my PIN number with this woman, it emerged what my old PIN number had been. Well, you know where this is going. She was the thief. And I gave her my old PIN number, and she went promptly to a cash machine and overdrew my checking account. And I found myself after that kind of haunted by that conversation because I had really expressed to her my anxiety and my worry about having been robbed, and she was very sympathetic. And the whole time, oh my God, I was such an idiot and she was the thief. But we had had this conversation, and I found myself thinking, you know, once the immediate horror of it all was over, you know, who was she? And what was that like from her side? And had she worked at a bank? How did she do that so well? It sort of lingered in my mind. So anyway, back to the bathroom. I look down, I see the wallet, and I think, oh my God, I mean, someone is going to take that, no question. And then I thought, but I'm the only person here right now. And it led to one of these kind of I felt a sort of excitement that I have come to recognize over many years as a sense that something might lead to fiction. I felt it in an old castle before I started my Gothic thriller, The Keep, and I felt it in the bathroom of the hotel when I looked down and saw the wallet. So I thought, you know, just for fun, instead of trying to work on this book that I seem to want to avoid, I'm just going to start writing from that moment when one woman sees another woman's wallet and takes it. And in a way, this is all fairly typical of the way that I work in a couple of ways. One is, I tend to, when I was a kid, a writer visited my school. I think I was in 3rd grade. And she was so exciting, a person who wrote real books. Oh my God, I still remember it so vividly. But she had one piece of advice for us that I think was actually the worst piece of advice I've ever received as a writer, which was write what you know. I don't like to write what I know, because I actually like to write what I want to know about, what I don't know about, what feels furthest from me. And I think that's one reason I often write as from the point of view of a man. This book is about 50-50, but The Keep, my last one, was overwhelmingly male. I'm trying to move back closer to the female. But I like to find ways to immediately separate what I'm writing about from my own experience. And so leaping into the point of view of the thief, when my experience has been that of the robbery victim so many times, is something that is exciting to me. Maybe a psychologist would say, well, it's kind of empowering because you get to be the thief instead of the victim, which is what you usually are. I don't know, but the point is, it's fun to be lifted out of my own experience and to have an experience of discovery through writing. The second thing is, and this is something we were talking about a little bit at dinner, my writing process is one of knowing very little when I start about what I'm going to do. It's really a sense of exploration. The one thing I do kind of need, though, to get going is a sense of time and place. Those are what I require. And it's often best if I don't actually have much more than that at the beginning. Just a sense of where and when. And then even the people seem to come out of that. I don't necessarily have them going in. So in the case of this book, it was a hotel bathroom around 2006. There's a wallet. Let's go. And so the next day I wrote from that moment and began what ultimately has become chapter 1. And I thought I would just read you the first couple of pages of that so you can get a sense of that fictional transformation that went on in the writing process. I mean, of course, this is, I write not knowing what will happen or whom I'm writing about, but in the course of very extensive editing, I not only know all of that stuff, but I'm very careful about outlining and deciding what needs to change to make it better. But the initial outpouring is very intuitive. Okay, this chapter is called Found Objects. It began the usual way in the bathroom of the Lassimo Hotel. Sasha was adjusting her yellow eyeshadow in the mirror when she noticed a bag on the floor beside the sink that must have belonged to the woman whose peeing she could faintly hear through the vault-like door of a toilet stall. Inside the rim of the bag, barely visible, was a wallet made of pale green leather. It was easy for Sasha to recognize, looking back, that the peeing woman's blind trust had provoked her. We live in a city where people will steal the hair off your head if you give them half a chance, but you leave your stuff lying in plain sight and expect it to be waiting for you when you come back? It made her want to teach the woman a lesson. But this wish only camouflaged the deeper feeling Sasha always had, that fat, tender wallet offering itself to her hand. It seemed so dull, so life as usual, to just leave it there, rather than seize the moment, accept the challenge, take the leap, fly the coop, throw caution to the wind, live dangerously. I get it, Kaz, her therapist said, and take the fucking thing. You mean steal it. He was trying to get Sasha to use that word, which was harder to avoid in the case of a wallet than with a lot of the things she'd lifted over the past year when her condition, as Kaz referred to it, had begun to accelerate. 5 sets of keys, 14 pairs of sunglasses, a child's striped scarf, binoculars, a cheese grater, a pocket knife, 28 bars of soap, and 85 pens, ranging from the cheap ballpoints she'd used to sign debit card slips to the aubergine Visconti that cost $260 online, which she'd lifted from her former boss's lawyer during a contracts meeting. Sasha no longer took anything from stores. Their cold, inert goods didn't tempt her, only from people. Okay, she said, steal it. Sasha and Kaz had dubbed that feeling she got the personal challenge, as in taking the wallet was a way for Sasha to assert her toughness, her individuality. What they needed to do was switch things around in her head so that the challenge became not taking the wallet, but leaving it. That would be the cure, although Kaz never used words like cure. He wore funky sweaters and let her call him Kaz, but he was old school inscrutable, to the point where Sasha couldn't tell if he was gay or straight, if he'd written famous books, or if, as she sometimes suspected, he was one of those escaped cons who impersonate surgeons and wind up leaving their operating tools inside people's skulls. Of course, these questions could have been resolved on Google in less than a minute, but they were useful questions, according to Kaz, and so far, Sasha had resisted. The couch where she lay in his office was blue leather and very soft. Kaz liked the couch, he'd told her, because it relieved them both of the burden of eye contact. You don't like eye contact? Sasha had asked. It seemed like a weird thing for a therapist to admit. I find it tiring, he'd said. This way we can both look where we want. Where will you look? He smiled. You can see my options. Where do you usually look when people are on the couch? Around the room, Kaz said, at the ceiling, into space. Do you ever sleep? No. Sasha usually looked at the window, which faced the street, and tonight, as she continued her story, was rippled with rain. She'd glimpsed the wallet, tender and overripe as a peach. She'd plucked it from the woman's bag and slipped it into her own small handbag, which she'd zipped shut before the sound of peeing had stopped. She'd flicked open the bathroom door and floated back through the lobby to the bar. She and the wallet's owner had never seen each other. Pre-wallet, Sasha had been in the grip of a dire evening. Lame date, yet another, brooding behind dark bangs, sometimes glancing at the flat-screen TV where a Jets game seemed to interest him more than Sasha's admittedly overhandled tales of Benny Salazar, her old boss, who was famous for founding the Sow's Ear record label and who also, Sasha happened to know, sprinkled gold flakes into his coffee as an aphrodisiac, she suspected, and sprayed pesticide in his armpits. Post-wallet, however, the scene tingled with mirthful possibility. Sasha felt the waiters eyeing her as she sidled back to the table, holding her handbag with its secret weight. She sat down and took a sip of her Melon Madness martini and cocked her head at Alex. She smiled her yes-no smile. Hello, she said. The yes-no smile was amazingly effective. You're happy, Alex said. I'm always happy, Sasha said. Sometimes I just forget. Alex had paid the bill while she was in the bathroom, clear proof that he'd been on the verge of aborting their date. Now he studied her. You feel like going somewhere else? So I'm going to pause there and say a couple of things. One is that the big surprise when I started writing this, as you can probably guess from having heard the anecdote that led to it, was the whole therapy element. That just emerged completely without any planning. I write in a way that's as close to blindness as I can achieve without closing my eyes. I have absolutely illegible handwriting, and I write fiction by hand on yellow legal pads. And the more I write, the more inscrutable it becomes, to the point where ultimately I actually sometimes cannot read sections of it and have to just replace them with new material. And what I'm trying to achieve is a state of a kind of unthinking, sort of meditative state, I guess, although I don't meditate, where I feel like I'm really accessing my unconscious. And an example of how powerful the unconscious is in fiction, and I thank God for it every day because it's so much smarter than I am, is that Sasha is on a date with a guy named Alex. But what I did not know consciously is that Sasha and Alex are actually the same name. They begin and end this book, and Sasha and Alexander are actually the same name. I guess Sasha is a nickname for Alexander in Russian. So that's an example of the kind of thing that happens without my knowing. You know, someone could later say, look at that amazing idea she had to name them both the same name in different forms, but of course I had no idea. The therapy part emerged kind of to my surprise, and the idea that the action is unfolding in a way in two places at once is true throughout the chapter. So on the one hand, Sasha sees a wallet and takes it, and on the other hand, she is relaying all of this to her therapist. And I became interested in that once I saw that I had done it, and thought, that's kind of an interesting technical challenge. Can I write a story that is literally taking place in two places at once? We are sort of literally in both places all the time. When I finished this story, as I thought it was at the time, I found myself thinking again and again about that description of Benny Salazar, who puts gold flakes in his coffee and sprays pesticide in his armpits. When I wrote it, again, I was surprised by it as it emerged on the page, because that's just kind of how it works for me. But I kept it because I thought it was sort of a funny thumbnail sketch of a decadent record producer. But later I found myself thinking, yeah, but thumbnail sketches that are funny are only funny because you're distant from the person that you're describing. In other words, it tells us nothing about why Benny does those things. Why does he spray pesticide in his armpits? I mean, it didn't seem good enough to leave it at that. So I thought, okay, I'm going to procrastinate. I'm going to write one more story, and then I really will get back to that book I'm supposed to be working on. But this time, I'm going to write about Benny. And the question I'm going to answer is, or I guess the time and place question, if you will, is roughly present day, although as you'll see, it takes place a little bit earlier in time. But the question was, why is he doing that stuff? So I'm going to read a couple of pages of chapter 2, which is called The Gold Cure. The shame memories began early that day for Benny during the morning meeting, while he listened to one of his senior executives make a case for pulling the plug on Stop Go, a sister band Benny had signed to a 3-record deal a couple of years back. Then, Stop Go had seemed like an excellent bet. The sisters were young and adorable. Their sound was gritty and simple and catchy. Cyndi Lauper meets Chrissie Hynde had been Benny's line early on. With a big gulping bass and some fun percussion, he recalled a cowbell. Plus, they'd written decent songs. Hell, they'd sold 12,000 CDs off the stage before Benny ever heard them play. A little time to develop potential singles, some clever marketing, and a decent video could put them over the top. But the sisters were pushing 30, his executive producer Colette informed Benny now, and no longer credible as recent high school grads, especially since one of them had a 9-year-old daughter. Their band members were in law school. They'd fired 2 producers and a third had quit. Still no album. Who's managing them? Benny asked. Their father. I've got their new rough mix, Colette said. The vocals are buried under 7 layers of guitar. It was then that the memory overcame Benny. Had the word sisters brought it on? Himself squatting behind a nunnery in Westchester at sunrise after a night of partying. 20 years ago, was it? More? Hearing waves of pure, ringing, spooky sweet sound waft into the paling sky, cloistered nuns who saw no one but one another, who'd taken vows of silence singing the Mass. Wet grass under his knees, its iridescence pulsing against his exhausted eyeballs. Even now, Benny could hear the unearthly sweetness of those nuns' voices echoing deep in his ears. He'd set up a meeting with their Mother Superior, the only nun you could talk to, brought along a couple of girls from the office for camouflage, and waited in a kind of anteroom until the Mother Superior appeared behind a square opening in the wall like a window without glass. She wore all white, a cloth tightly encircling her face. Benny remembered her laughing a lot, rosy cheeks lifting into swags, maybe from joy at the thought of bringing God into millions of homes, maybe at the novelty of an A&R guy in purple corduroy making his pitch. The deal was done in a matter of minutes. He'd approached the cutout square to say goodbye. Here, Benny thrashed in his conference room chair, anticipating the moment it was all leading up to. The Mother Superior leaned forward slightly, tilting her head in a way that must have triggered something in Benny, because he lurched across the sill and kissed her on the mouth. Velvety skin fuzz, an intimate baby powder smell in the half second before the nun cried out and jerked away, then pulling back, grinning through his dread, seeing her appalled, injured face. Benny? Colette was standing in front of the console, holding the Stop-Go CD. Everyone seemed to be waiting. You want to hear this? But Benny was caught in a loop from 20 years ago, lunging over the sill toward the Mother Superior like some haywire figure on a clock, again, again, again. No, he groaned. He turned his sweating face into the rivery breeze that gusted through the windows of the old Tribeca coffee factory where Sow's Ear Records had moved 6 years ago and now occupied 2 floors. He'd never recorded the nuns. By the time he'd returned from the convent, a message had been waiting. I don't, he told Colette, I don't want to hear the mix. He felt shaken, soiled. Benny dropped artists all the time, sometimes 3 in a week, but now his own shame tinged the Stop-Go sisters' failure, as if he were to blame. And that feeling was followed by a restless, opposing need to recall what had first excited him about the sisters, to feel that excitement again. Why don't I visit them? He said suddenly. Colette looked startled, then suspicious, then worried, a succession that would have amused Benny if he hadn't been so rattled. Really? She asked. Sure, I'll do it today after I see my kid. Benny's assistant, Sasha, brought him coffee, cream and 2 sugars. He shimmied a tiny red enameled box from his pocket, popped the tricky latch, pinched a few gold flakes between his trembling fingers, and released them into his cup. He'd begun this regimen 2 months ago after reading in a book on Aztec medicine that gold and coffee together were believed to ensure sexual potency. Benny's goal was more basic than potency, sex drive, his own having mysteriously expired. He wasn't sure quite when or quite why this had happened. The divorce from Stephanie, the battle over Christopher, having recently turned 44. The gold landed on the coffee's milky surface and spun wildly. Benny was mesmerized by this spinning, which he took as evidence of the explosive gold coffee chemistry. A frenzy of activity that had mostly led him in circles. Wasn't that a fairly accurate description of lust? At times, Benny didn't even mind its disappearance. It was sort of a relief not to be constantly wanting to fuck someone. The world was unquestionably a more peaceful place without the half hard-on that had been his constant companion since the age of 13. But did Benny want to live in such a world? He sipped his gold-inflected coffee and glanced at Sasha's breasts, which had become the litmus test he used to gauge his improvement. He'd lusted after her for most of the years she'd worked for him, first as an intern, then a receptionist, finally his assistant, where she'd remained, oddly reluctant to become an executive in her own right. And she'd somehow managed to elude that lust without ever saying no or hurting Benny's feelings or pissing him off. And now, Sasha's breasts in a thin yellow sweater, and Benny felt nothing. Not a shiver of harmless excitement. Could he even get it up if he wanted to? So that's an intro to Benny. So as you can kind of tell, they're pretty different from each other, those 2 chapters. And at that point, in the course of the Benny chapter, we hear a little bit about his ex-wife. We learn that that he never fit in Westchester. They got this big house there. He never felt comfortable, but she settled right in and is now on the #1 doubles team in the tennis club. And I thought, okay, so that conjures another kind of cliche. But again, cliches are nothing more than a measurement of our distance from what we're talking about. So I found myself thinking, who is this Stephanie? And why is she a tennis player? How did she end up married to a rock producer? What's the story? So I wrote one more delay, I thought, in this other book I'm really going to start very soon. But I just think I'm going to explore Stephanie a little bit. So I wrote another chapter about her that also took place earlier in time when she and Benny were still married. And at that point, Sasha is mentioned only in passing. So at that point, I realized that I was starting to have some fun with this. And I thought, what is fun exactly about this? And it seemed like what was exciting me about what I was doing were a few things. One, I loved the idea of taking a character who had been central, so Sasha in chapter 1, whose inner life we're right in the thick of, and making her this not only peripheral, but this sort of a character that Benny is literally sort of objectifying and using as a kind of ruler to measure his sexual inclinations at a particular moment. So we go from understanding her so deeply to seeing her very much from the outside through the eyes of someone who has absolutely no idea what's going on inside her. And that becomes really clear later in that chapter when Benny can't find his little container of gold flakes, and Sasha says, you dropped it, I picked it up, and hands it to him. And he's flooded with gratitude and relief, and we, the readers, know that she obviously took it from him. So there's this real disconnect between what we know and what Benny knows. I thought all of that was fun. I loved going backwards, and I loved making these kind of jumps in time backward and forward. I found it surprising. And so at that point, I thought, okay, I'm writing a book, and I have 3 rules as I go forward. And those rules are, 1, each chapter has to be about someone different, so no one gets to be the center twice. 2, each chapter has to feel different from all the others in mood and tone. And I guess a more kind of technical way of putting that would be, I wanted to have different writing technical choices each time. And number 3 was that I wanted each one to stand completely on its own. For many reasons, one of which is it's a lot to ask of a reader to start over in a certain way each time. I mean, I read you 2 beginnings, and those 2 chapters are back to back. You know, when you start that Benny chapter at the beginning, you have no idea how this relates to Sasha, if at all. And even when she does come into the picture, it's peripherally, so we're kind of starting over with Benny's story, and that happens literally every single time. Although at a certain point, I think we become enmeshed enough that we maybe recognize where we are faster. But I love the idea especially, and it may just be the kind of voyeur in me, of seeing someone out of the corner of your eye and thinking, what's up with them? And then satisfying that curiosity by just kind of plunging the reader into the middle of that person's life. So I'm going to just give you an example of that. This is then from the 3rd chapter I wrote when I think I was still telling myself I was just stalling a little before I started the book. This one is about Stephanie, but the little thumbnail sketch that I'm going to read you is actually about her boss. So to give you a little setup, Stephanie is a publicist dealing with the music industry. She's just had a kind of tough time. Her brother's visiting, and he's recently out of prison and driving her crazy. And they've just had a sort of draining encounter with a rock star who's now kind of cancerous and miserable. So she's in a bad mood, and she goes to visit her boss. Stephanie got through her next meeting with a designer of small patent leather purses, then ignored a warning instinct and stopped by the office. Her boss, La Dalle, was on the phone as always, but she muted the call and yelled from her office, "What's wrong?" "Nothing," Stephanie said, startled. She was still in the hall. "All good with Purseman?" La Dalle kept effortless track of her employees' schedules, even freelancers like Stephanie. "Just fine." La Dalle finished her call, shot some espresso from the Krups machine on her desk into her bottomless, thimble-sized cup, and called, "Come, Steph." Stephanie entered her boss's soaring corner office. La Dalle was one of those people who seem, even to those who know them well, digitally enhanced. The bright blonde bob cut, the predatory lipstick, the roving algorithmic eyes. "Next time," she said, tweezing Stephanie briefly with her gaze, "cancel the meeting." "I'm sorry?" "I could feel your gloom from the hall," La Dalle said. "It's like having the flu. Don't expose the clients." Stephanie laughed. She had known her boss forever, long enough to know that she was absolutely serious. "God, you're a bitch," she said. La Dalle chuckled, already dialing again. "It's a burden," she said. So that's all we know of La Dalle. In the next chapter, which is called Selling the General, we begin this way, which this takes place later. So I'm moving not just forward, and not just backward in time, as in the first couple of chapters I read, but this time forward. Dolly's first big idea was the hat. She picked teal blue, fuzzy, with flaps that came down over the general's large, dried apricot ears. The ears were unsightly, Dolly thought, and best covered up. When she saw the general's picture in the Times a few days later, she almost choked on her poached egg. He looked like a baby, a big, sick baby with a giant mustache and a double chin. The headline couldn't have been worse. General B's odd headgear spurs cancer rumors. Local unrest grows. Dolly bolted to her feet in her dingy kitchen and turned in a frantic circle, spilling tea on her bathrobe. She looked wildly at the general's picture, and then she realized the ties. They hadn't cut off the ties under the hat as she'd instructed, and a big fuzzy bow under the general's double chin was disastrous. Dolly ran barefoot into her office bedroom and began plowing through fax pages, trying to unearth the most recent sequence of numbers she was supposed to call to reach ARC, the general's human relations captain. The general moved a lot to avoid assassination, but ARC was meticulous about faxing Dolly their updated contact information. These faxes usually came at around 3 a.m., waking Dolly and sometimes her daughter Lulu. Dolly never mentioned the disruption. The general and his team were under the impression that she was the top publicist in New York, a woman whose fax machine would be in a corner office with a panoramic view of New York City, as indeed it had been for many years, not 10 inches away from the fold-out sofa where she slept. Dolly could only attribute their misapprehension to some dated article that had drifted their way from Vanity Fair or InStyle or People, where Dolly had been written about and profiled under her then moniker, La Doll. The first call from the general's camp had come just in time. Dolly had hawked her last piece of jewelry. She was copy editing textbooks until 2 a.m., sleeping until 5, and then providing polite phone chit-chat to aspiring English speakers in Tokyo until it was time to wake Lulu and fix her breakfast. And all of that wasn't nearly enough to keep Lulu in Miss Rutgers' school for girls. Often Dolly's 3 allotted hours of sleep were spent in spasms of worry at the thought of the next monstrous tuition bill. And then ARC had called. The general wanted an exclusive retainer. He wanted rehabilitation, American sympathy, an end to the CIA's assassination attempts. If Gaddafi could do it, why not he? See, this is already dated. Dolly wondered seriously if overwork and lack of sleep were making her hallucinate, but she named a price. When the first installment appeared in her bank account, Dolly's relief was so immense that it almost obliterated the tiny, anxious, muttering voice inside her, "Your client is a genocidal dictator." Dolly had worked with shitheads before, God knew. If she didn't take this job, someone else would snap it up. Being a publicist is about not judging your clients. These excuses were lined up in formation, ready for deployment, should that small, dissident voice pluck up its courage to speak with any volume. But lately, Dolly couldn't even hear it. Now, as she scuttled over her frayed Persian rug, looking for the general's most recent numbers, the phone rang. It was 6 a.m. Dolly lunged, praying Lulu's sleep wouldn't be disturbed. Hello? But she knew who it was. "We are not happy," said ARC. "Me either," Dolly said. "You didn't cut off the general is not happy." "ARC, listen to me. You need to cut off the general is not happy, Miss Peel. Listen to me, ARC. He is not happy. That's because, look, take a scissors. He is not happy, Miss Peel." Dolly went quiet. There were times listening to ARC's silken monotone when she'd been sure she'd heard a curl of irony around the words he'd been ordered to say, like he was speaking to her in code. Now there was a prolonged pause. Dolly spoke very softly. "ARC, take a scissors and cut the ties off the hat. There shouldn't be a goddamn bow under the general's chin." "He will no longer wear this hat. He has to wear the hat. He will not wear it. He refuses." "Cut off the ties, ARC." "Rumors have reached us, Miss Peel." Her stomach lurched. "Rumors? That you are not on top as you once were, and now the hat is unsuccessful." Dolly felt the negative forces pulling in around her, standing there with the traffic of 8th Avenue grinding past beneath her window, fingering her frizzy hair that she'd stopped coloring and allowed to grow in long and gray. She felt a jab of some deep urgency. "I have enemies, Ark," she said, "just like the general." He was silent. "If you listen to my enemies, I can't do my job. Now take out that fancy pen I can see in your pocket every time you get your picture in the paper and write this down. Cut the strings off the hat. Push the hat. Lose the bow. Push the hat farther back on the general's head so some of his hair fluffs out in front. Do that, Ark, and let's see what happens." Lulu had come into the room and was rubbing her eyes in her pink pajamas. Dolly looked at her watch, saw that her daughter had lost a half hour of sleep, and experienced a small inner collapse at the thought of Lulu feeling tired at school. She put her arms around her daughter's shoulders. Lulu received this embrace with the regal bearing that was her trademark. Dolly had forgotten Ark, but now he spoke from the phone at her neck. "I will do this, Miss Peel." It was several weeks before the general's picture appeared again. Now the hat was pushed back and the ties were gone. The headline read, "Extent of B's war crimes may be exaggerated. New evidence shows." It was the hat. He looked sweet in the hat. How could a man in a fuzzy blue hat have used human bones to pave his roads? Liddell had met with Ruin on New Year's Eve 2 years ago at a wildly anticipated party that was projected by the cultural history-minded pundits she'd considered worth inviting to rival Truman Capote's black and white ball. The party, it was called, or the list, as in, is he on the list? A party to celebrate what? In retrospect, Dolly wasn't sure. The fact that Americans had never been richer, despite the turmoil roiling the world? The party had nominal hosts, all famous, but the real hostess, as everyone knew, was Liddell, who had more connections and access and juju than all of these people combined. And Liddell had made a very human mistake, or so she tried to soothe herself at night when memories of her demise plowed through her like a hot poker, causing her to writhe on her sofa bed and swill brandy from the bottle. She'd thought that because she could do something very, very well, namely get the best people into one room at one time, that she could do other things well too, like design. And Liddell had had a vision. Broad, translucent trays of oil and water suspended beneath small, brightly colored spotlights, whose heat would make the opposing liquids twist and bubble and swirl. She'd imagined people craning their necks to look up, spellbound by the shifting liquid shapes. And they did look up. They marveled at the lit trays. Liddell saw them do it from a small booth she'd had constructed high up and to one side so she could view the panorama of her achievement. From there, she was the first to notice as midnight approached that something was awry with the translucent trays that held the water and oil. They were sagging a little. Were they? They were slumping like sacks from their chains and melting, in other words. And then they began to collapse, flop and drape and fall away, sending scalding oil onto the heads of every glamorous person in the country and some other countries too. They were burned, scarred, maimed in the sense that tear-shaped droplets of scar tissue on the forehead of a movie star or small bald patches on the head of an art dealer or a model or a generally fabulous person constitute maiming. But something shut down in Liddell as she stood there, away from the burning oil. She didn't call 911. She gaped in frozen disbelief as her guests shrieked and staggered and covered their heads, tore hot, soaked garments from their flesh, and crawled over the floor like people in medieval altar paintings whose earthly luxuries have consigned them to hell. All right, I'm going to pause there and give you guys some time for questions, but that's an example of the way that, someone that we see very peripherally, this boss who seems, almost inhumanly strong, is, her fate is sort of instant. We then meet her later and realize that things have gone terribly awry, and so the question becomes, why? What happened? So that was something that I tried to do throughout the book, to take peripheral characters and then plunge us into their inner lives and reveal them either before or after, and to give the reader again and again that shock of time having passed or evaporated, and to realize how much has happened in the pause during which events were happening that we weren't reading about.
I'm Karen Escobedo, Manager of Community Outreach for New Jersey Natural Gas, and I got my start at Brookdale.
To learn more about how to get your start at Brookdale, visit brookdalecc.edu.
When did I realize that this would actually be the book and not just a distraction from something else? I think when I wrote the third chapter, there was actually something else I didn't mention, which is maybe interesting to writing students. I had written 4 stories years earlier and published all of them, but wasn't quite sure what I would ultimately do with them. They all felt sort of like they might be part of something bigger. When I was writing the third story, which was about Stephanie, the ex-wife, and she's the one who goes to visit Liddell when she's still powerful, I think I mentioned to you that her brother has recently been released from prison. He was a character from one of those older stories, which I had written in the form of a celebrity profile. A writer goes to interview a young movie star. He's unhappy in all kinds of ways, and one of the things he's most unhappy about is that she's incredibly powerful, beautiful, and young, and he's incredibly powerless, unattractive, he thinks, and sort of approaching middle-aged. And all of these forces kind of come to bear on this interview, and without giving it away, suffice it to say that he ends up in jail for some years. So I kind of love the idea of bringing him back into action in that chapter, and I just decided to see what would happen if I sort of imported him years later after his release. And again, I found it kind of fun to meet this guy later. And once that tentacle had extended from the older work and kind of attached itself to the new project, I think at that point I realized it was all part of one constellation. And then that's when I sort of came up with my rules and moved forward, excitedly, and stopped worrying about the other one. Well, some might say I did not actually make it sound like one novel. That was the big question. I mean, I guess here's the logic behind the choice of having each part be as different from the others as it is, because the more common kind of connected novel in stories or connected stories book tends to have a kind of sameness of tone and mood among the pieces, as if to try to almost, in my opinion, kind of overcompensate for the fact that they're separate by making it feel like they're all one thing. But my feeling was, if I'm writing this book in separate pieces, why not try to make them as different from each other as they can be and yet still fuse together? That seemed like a great challenge. So you've just named what the essence of that challenge, which is the worst case scenario is it just feels like a hodgepodge. But I think that one thing that can be so helpful to sort of ask, especially when you feel yourself heading off into new territory in a way, what are my models here? Whom am I emulating? And I had a few. One was the television show The Sopranos, or the idea of any TV series, which is not that central. You can't fill a whole season with one driving plot line. Actually, I shouldn't say that. I watch so little television, maybe you can. But the kind of series I'm thinking of, the last thing I should be doing is, opining about what you can and cannot do on television. But the thing that's kind of fun about a series like The Sopranos is that it feels very lateral. It feels like there are a lot of things going on at once. It's more of a constellation of stories than just one story. And sometimes in one episode, you are on a bit of a tangent, and you're not quite sure how it's all going to fit together. You won't know until later. I like the idea of trying to do that in fiction. Another one of my models was basically a record album. A record album, which is a fast-dying form. I mean, I think of it as the old kind with an A-side and a B-side, but even if you're just talking about an album, a CD, which are, of course, being bought less and less often because we now use iTunes and buy hits. But the idea is a kind of overarching story or theme that consists of parts that are really different from each other. I mean, the reason an album works is that there's a lot of variety inside it, and usually the musicians try to emphasize that by juxtaposing songs that are quite different from each other. So you go from slow to fast, and that shock of like the next song being really fast when the one before has been slow is kind of exciting. That's the kind of excitement I wanted here. So, and then another model was actually Proust, who wrote an extremely long book called In Search of Lost Time in many volumes, which I tried to read in my 20s and was terribly bored by. But whenever the obsessive love part paused and we got into memories about time, I thought, oh, who cares about time? Because you kind of don't in your early 20s, or I didn't. But later, I found the time part extremely exciting and interesting. And in his book, he weaves together all kinds of stories about all kinds of people over many, many, many years. So all of that was together in my mind. And so I guess what I had to hope, and this was, writing sometimes is a little like a chemistry experiment. You sort of put it all into the beaker, but you don't really know what will happen. My hope was that these parts that were extremely different from each other would fuse through a kind of chemical reaction into one story that would be made more powerful, not less powerful, by the fact that they were so different from each other, that the breadth and the scope of what the reader would have experienced would exceed what you could do in a conventional novel. And for what I mean by that is, for example, there are some parts of this book that are openly tragic. I mean, they're incredibly sad. There are also parts like what I just read you about Dolly and the general that are rather farcical and satirical, although now that we've discovered that Gaddafi was hiring PR people to basically doing exactly what Dolly is doing here, it seems a little bit less like satire, but I certainly intended it as satire. So the idea of all of that being, and then there are parts of the book that are sort of almost farcical. I mean, they're silly. It's hard to do all of that stuff in a conventional novel without it feeling like it's sort of uneven and not fitting together. But since this clearly doesn't fit together in the usual way, it consists of pieces, it seemed like I might try to do that. I didn't know if it would work, that's the truth. And I don't think it does work for everyone. But my hope, that was my hope. That was how I imagined it. Yes, the question is, how did music figure in? The novel certainly surrounds the music industry in all kinds of ways, and I think for a lot of different reasons. One of which is that I've always wanted to write about music as a journalist and could never really get a successful assignment, so I finally had to resort to fiction. But I think also, the book is very much about time and change and technology, as I think any book about time and change nowadays sort of has to be. And I think the fate of the music industry, which has yet to be decided, but which I think, as we all know, is struggling terribly as a result of technological change, made it seem like a really good lens through which to look at some of those things. I don't normally listen to any music as I work, so it was actually interesting to see how that changed as I was working on this book. I definitely listened to music quite a bit, partly because changing the mood and tone every single time I moved from one chapter to the next was actually very hard for me. It was just hard to kind of get myself into a new mindset, and music was a great way of just kind of resetting my own mood and spirit. So for example, there's one chapter that takes place in the 70s, so I found myself listening to a lot of Santana while I was working on that, just because it kind of helped me get there. There's a chapter that takes place in San Francisco in the late 70s, in the beginnings of the punk rock time there, and it was actually really fun to revisit old bands I remembered from high school when I would go to the club that I was writing about. They're all on YouTube, even the ones that never recorded anything and never had a record. It's sort of amazing that there's just footage of all these bands. And then maybe because the book was so much about music and I felt very connected to the role of music in my life as I was working on it, I also just found certain songs helpful to my process for reasons that I never could quite pinpoint. I would just hear a song that seemed like it would help me with a particular part, and I would listen to it rather obsessively to help me write that part. And if you go to my website, actually, there are a few things on there. There's a little entry about each chapter and kind of the points of connection to my own life, which are usually mostly in terms of setting, because as I said, I don't tend to write about me and almost never people I know. there's often a song listed in each of those associations to kind of directly answer your question. There's also the PowerPoint, which in the book is of course in black and white, looks like this. I created a color slideshow of that on my website. I worked incredibly hard on the colors because it was really amazing to kind of render up times of day through color. There's a kind of long sunset out in the desert, and my God, I felt like I just was going to become a PowerPoint colorist and give up my fiction career. I got so into trying to identify each gradation of that sunset. But the other really cool thing about it, the chapter is called Great Rock and Roll Pauses, and it's narrated by the daughter of Sasha, the wallet thief from chapter 1. So it takes place in the future. She now has a 11 and a 12-year-old. Her daughter, Allison, is keeping her journal in PowerPoint, and she's talking about her sort of Asperger's brother, Lincoln, who's obsessed with pauses in rock and roll songs. And he lectures about these pauses, which makes his dad go totally ballistic. And in my slideshow version, you can actually hear each of the little clips of music that I write about with the pause in it, 10-second clips. So it's kind of cool. You can just run it as a continuous slideshow, and you get all of the text and the music. So music was really important, and I'm kind of curious to see if that's going to last, whether I will continue to need music now in my writing of fiction or not. I don't know if it was just limited to that book. I have a feeling it might have been. When I was working on the third chapter about Stephanie, the ex-wife, and I felt it connecting up with old material, at that point, and that's when I kind of made my 3 rules. At that point, I just said, okay, this is what I'm doing. It was interesting, though. A lot of the challenge of this was about understanding what the connections would be among different parts, and for some reason, that seemed to always happen in the shower. So I feel like a lot of my writing process actually occurred late at night during extremely wasteful showers, which I would feel so guilty about later, because I think, my God, I know water is short and this is ridiculous. But I would stand there, and for some reason, in those moments, I would understand kind of what the relationship between all of the characters was, and kind of, because one of the dangers with something like this is the question is, what do you pursue? I mean, you could just go on forever. At what point are you done? And I definitely had some failures. There were characters that I wanted to pursue that I wasn't able to do successfully. So I did have to have these times of kind of standing back and trying to understand what it was as a whole, what I needed to have, what I couldn't live without. One of the things I really, really wanted, and it was one of the 2 hardest things, one was the PowerPoint, which I slipped in at the last minute, and which I think is kind of the heart of the book in some ways. But the other was I really wanted to see Sasha in college, Sasha the wallet thief from the first chapter. And I had such a hard time getting to her there. Like I tried breaking my rule and writing a chapter from her point of view in college, but I had set up that rule for a reason, and guess what? It didn't work to try to write about Sasha twice. So then the question was, okay, so who is near enough to Sasha that the chapter can be about them and yet totally revealing of Sasha in college? Those kinds of logistical issues became really tough, because each time you take on a new character, you've got a whole new life you're contending with, and other peripheral characters from their life that perhaps should be explored. And before you know it, you're going on, I'm writing a 7-volume book of my own, which I really didn't want to do. So again, the answer for me to a lot of those questions is just instinct, just a kind of gut sense of when I've got enough and when it's right. I think I do, in the end, I trust that more than the thinking part of me. And so that was kind of what guided me every step of the way, really. When I do the blind writing, I end up throwing out a lot of it. I would say that ultimately, probably many of those actual words are replaced by other words. My technique in writing this book was no different from any other, though. And basically it goes like this. I write by hand on yellow legal pads. I try to write 5 to 7 pages a day. When I have a complete draft, which in the case of this book meant a shorter piece since I wrote it in pieces, but in the case of a novel, it means literally a draft of the novel, I sit down and I type it up, which is dreadful. I mean, but I could never get anyone else. I could never hire anyone to do it because no one could ever read my writing. I often can't even read it myself. Then I sit down and I read those typed pages, which is also really tough because I'm now reading in a manuscript form something that was written very, impulsively. And so, of course, there's tons of repetition. Sometimes I'll literally forget characters' names, and their names end up changing partway through the manuscript. There are lots of cliches. It's just what you get when you're grabbing whatever is nearby. But usually, there's also stuff that's interesting. And so all I'm trying to do with that first draft is generate enough interesting material that I'll have something to work with moving forward. Then I make very detailed outlines about what I've got, what I think it could be, and what I need to do to get it one step closer to being that. And then I'll do a long revision, editing by hand on hard copies, type in my changes, and just generate a number of drafts until I have another draft that feels like a step forward. Then I'll sit down and read it through, make another list of changes, a new outline. And it goes on for years, It's not a quick process for me.